Apocalypse Never. This video is based on key insights from the book Apocalypse Never by Michael Shellenberger. Introduction. Michael Shellenberger, an environmental activist and author, delves into the topic of biases, alarmism, and financial interests within the climate change movement, particularly focusing on Extinction Rebellion, XR. In early 2019, XR, a group founded by scientists and professors, began 2 weeks of civil disobedience in London and other cities to protest lack of action against climate change. Their methods included blocking major bridges in London, causing inconvenience for thousands. XR's main spokesperson made bold statements, claiming billions of people are going to die due to climate change and accusing governments of inaction. These dramatic claims attracted widespread support, including celebrities like Benedict Cumberbatch and Olivia Colman. However, public sympathy started to wane as the group's actions disrupted daily life. Shellenberger highlights a Sky News interview where a host questioned XR spokesperson Sarah Lunnan about families missing out on important moments due to the protests. Lunnan apologized, emphasizing the gravity of the situation for future generations while seemingly downplaying the immediate human impact. A notable XR action involved driving a fire truck to the British Treasury and spraying fake blood made from beet juice onto the building. This stunt, meant to highlight climate fragility, ended up causing chaos and inconvenience for commuters. The movement faced backlash when, during a tube station protest, activists climbed onto a train, disrupting service. Angry passengers yelled at the protesters, leading to minor altercations. The incident underscored growing public frustration with XR's tactics. Despite this, some media personalities seem to align with XR's climate concerns, but question their methods. For instance, TV hosts on This Morning acknowledged the urgency of climate change while criticizing disruptions to daily life. Shellenberger argues that such reactions reflect broader societal confusion over environmental crises. He suggests that many perceive climate change as an existential threat, justifying extreme actions. Yet, when those actions directly impact individuals' livelihoods, public support wanes. The author contends that exaggerated claims and alarmism within the environmental movement can hinder progress. He posits that financial interests might play a role in perpetuating such narratives. For example, some organizations or individuals may benefit from maintaining a sense of crisis to secure funding or influence. Ultimately, Shellenberger calls for a more balanced and fact-based approach to environmental advocacy. He emphasizes the importance of separating scientific facts from sensationalized claims, promoting humanistic solutions that consider both environmental needs and societal well-being. His book, Apocalypse Never, seeks to contribute to this dialogue by defending mainstream science against alarmist interpretations from both the political right and left. Chapter 1, It's Not the End of the World. Michael Shellenberger explores the topic of environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests in his work. He argues that some climate change predictions are exaggerated, driven by various factors. Shellenberger critiques the media for often emphasizing the most pessimistic climate scenarios, turning them into likely futures. This is what he calls a filtering mechanism that transforms carefully caveated scientific predictions into alarmist narratives. He points out examples of such exaggerations. For instance, an Associated Press article from 1989 warned of catastrophic consequences by the year 2000 if global warming wasn't reversed. Similarly, The Uninhabitable Earth, a book by David Wallace Wells, presents worst-case scenarios to induce panic. Shellenberger also discusses tipping points, like rapid ice sheet melting or Amazon rainforest die-off. He argues that the high level of uncertainty and complexity around these scenarios make them unscientific. He suggests they're similar to other potential disasters, such as asteroid impacts or deadly flu outbreaks, for which we don't take radical preventive measures because it would make societies poorer. He underscores the importance of economic development in making societies resilient to climate change. Shellenberger believes that richer nations are better equipped to handle environmental challenges. He advocates for a balanced approach, reducing emissions without undermining economic growth or people's well-being. Interestingly, Shellenberger notes that carbon emissions have been decreasing in developed countries for over a decade. For example, emissions in Europe are 23% below 1990 levels, and in the US, they dropped by 15% from 2005 to 2016. He also highlights the significant decline in emissions from electricity generation, 27% in the US and 63% in the UK between 2007 and 2018. Shellenberger suggests that as developing nations become wealthier, their emissions will likely peak and then decrease, mirroring what happened in developed countries. This could keep global temperature rise within safer limits, around 2 to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, rather than the more dangerous 4 degrees. Despite these positive trends, Shellenberger attributes little to climate alarmism influencing emission reductions. Instead, he credits technological shifts like switching from coal to natural gas and nuclear power technologies, often opposed by many climate activists due to their environmental impacts. In essence, Shellenberger's work questions the alarmism surrounding climate change, pointing out exaggerations driven by media sensationalism and certain financial interests. He emphasizes the need for balanced approaches that consider both environmental protection and economic development. Chapter 2: Earth's Lungs Aren't Burning. Michael Shellenberger explores the topic of environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests in his narrative. He begins by discussing the widespread fear that the Amazon rainforest, often called Earth's lungs, is crucial for producing oxygen and combating global warming. This notion is debunked by Shellenberger, who explains that while the Amazon does produce oxygen, it also consumes nearly as much through respiration, making its net contribution to Earth's oxygen supply insignificant. Shellenberger highlights how this misconception stems from a 1966 article by a Cornell University scientist, which was later dismissed by a climatologist in the journal Science. Despite this scientific consensus, the myth persists and is often perpetuated for dramatic effect, such as when celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio and Madonna share images of Amazon fires on social media. The narrative then shifts to examine the role of financial interests in environmental activism. Shellenberger points out that European leaders' concerns over Amazon deforestation seem tied to their economic fears, as they seek to protect their agricultural sectors from cheaper Brazilian imports. This is evident in France and Ireland's strong opposition to the EU-Mercosur trade deal, driven by protectionist motives rather than genuine environmental concern. Shellenberger argues that environmental organizations like Greenpeace have contributed to Amazon deforestation through their policies. By advocating for strict land use regulations and limiting agricultural expansion into less biodiverse areas, these groups inadvertently pushed farmers into more sensitive rainforest zones. This extensive extensification, as opposed to the intended intensification, growing more food on less land, has resulted in increased deforestation and habitat fragmentation. The narrative also reveals how historical patterns of deforestation mirror modern practices. Just as European agriculture expansion led to significant forest loss centuries ago, contemporary Brazilian farmers are clearing land for agriculture, particularly soybean cultivation and cattle ranching. However, unlike in Europe's past, this expansion is not driven by technological advancements, but rather by economic necessity amidst poverty and recession. Shellenberger concludes by emphasizing the need for balanced environmental policies that consider both ecological preservation and socioeconomic realities. He suggests that supporting agricultural intensification, providing technical assistance to farmers, and focusing on restoring degraded lands could help reduce pressure on primary forests without compromising food production or economic development. By acknowledging the complex interplay between environmental conservation and human needs, Shellenberger advocates for more nuanced and effective strategies in preserving Earth's biodiversity. Chapter 3: Enough with the plastic straws. Michael Shellenberger explores the issue of environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests in his chapter about plastic pollution. He uses the story of Christine Figener, a marine biologist, who removed a plastic straw from a sea turtle's nostril off the coast of Costa Rica. This event sparked global concern over plastic waste, leading to bans on plastic straws in cities like Seattle and San Francisco, and even Starbucks. However, Shellenberger points out that plastic straws are not the main issue. Only 0.03% of ocean plastic waste consists of straws. Instead, he argues that focusing on straw bans distracts from the real problem: the massive amount of plastic waste entering the oceans every year. Shellenberger delves into the persistence of plastic in the environment. He explains how plastic debris can significantly increase sea turtle mortality rates, with half of all turtles having ingested plastic, and up to 100% of some populations doing so. Ingested plastic can rupture stomachs and obstruct digestive systems, often leading to starvation or internal bleeding. The author also discusses the global consumption of plastics, which has skyrocketed since the 1960s. Between 1950 and 2015, global production increased from 2 million tons to nearly 400 million tons. Despite recycling efforts, much of this waste ends up in landfills or is incinerated. Only a small portion, less than 1/3 in rich countries, is actually recycled. Shellenberger highlights the role of developing nations in plastic waste. He notes that 4 countries, China, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, produce half of all mismanaged plastic waste at risk of entering the ocean. This waste often comes from littering, manufacturing, and recreational activities near coastlines. The author also touches on the issue of waste management infrastructure in developing countries. He argues that improving this infrastructure is crucial for reducing plastic waste in the oceans, even if it means higher costs. This could involve transitioning from open dumping to efficient collection and sanitary landfills, despite the financial burden. Shellenberger critiques the notion of plastic as an environmental threat due to its longevity. He discusses a study that found much less microplastic than expected in the ocean, suggesting that sea life might be packaging it into fecal pellets, causing it to sink rather than accumulate at the surface. He also explores the history of plastics and their impact on endangered species. For instance, tortoiseshell from hawksbill turtles was highly valued for making luxury items until synthetic alternatives like celluloid were invented. This shift away from natural materials helped protect sea turtles and elephants from overexploitation. The author suggests that our biases towards natural materials can be harmful, citing the tortoiseshell trade as an example. He argues that embracing artificial substitutes is necessary for conservation, but companies must develop better alternatives to fossil-based plastics within 5 years to meet his expectations. Shellenberger critiques the focus on plastic straws, suggesting it distracts from more pressing threats like overfishing and habitat loss. He points out that while plastic pollution is visible and concerning, other factors like illegal fishing and habitat destruction pose equally significant risks to sea turtles and other marine life. Lastly, the author discusses the complex issue of waste management in developing nations. He proposes that companies like Coca-Cola should take responsibility for waste management in countries with unstable governments, arguing that this could circumvent corruption and improve waste collection. However, he acknowledges that this solution might lead to higher consumer costs for products. In essence, Shellenberger's chapter challenges common assumptions about plastic pollution and environmental conservation. He argues for a more nuanced understanding of the issues, considering factors like financial interests, biases, and the effectiveness of various solutions. Chapter 4: The Sixth Extinction is Cancelled. Michael Shellenberger, in his exploration of environmental issues, delves into the topic of environmental biases, alarmist claims, and financial interests. He begins by discussing the American Museum of Natural History, where a prehistoric scene of predator and prey greets millions of annual visitors. Simultaneously, a bronze plaque warns about the sixth extinction, caused primarily by human activities. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, report from 2019 suggests that 1 million species face extinction due to humans. This rate is significantly higher than in the past 10 million years, potentially leading to substantial losses in amphibians, marine mammals, and reptiles. However, Shellenberger questions this narrative, pointing out that the IPBES might not be the leading authority on species extinction. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, estimates a much lower annual extinction rate of 0.001%. This organization categorizes only 6% of species as critically endangered, 9% as endangered, and 12% as vulnerable. Since 1500, the IUCN has documented an extinction rate of merely 0.8%, equating to fewer than 2 species vanishing annually. Shellenberger argues that claims of accelerated extinction rates may undermine conservation efforts. He asserts that these alarmism tactics can mislead the public and discourage the value of conservation biology. Conservationists have historically been skilled in preserving small animal populations, yet their main challenge remains population expansion. Despite the assertion that humankind has failed to protect habitats, Shellenberger highlights numerous protected areas worldwide. In 2019, an area larger than Africa was designated as protected, encompassing 15% of Earth's land surface. The number of protected zones has risen dramatically from 9,214 in 1962 to over 244,869 in 2020. In the Albertine Rift region, which spans parts of Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda, protected areas have increased from 49% to 60% between 2000 and 2016. Shellenberger contends that the true challenge isn't extinction, but rather the decline in animal populations and habitat degradation. Between 1970 and 2010, wild mammal, bird, fish, reptile, and amphibian species populations dropped by roughly half, with Latin America experiencing an 83% decline and South and Southeast Asia seeing a 67% drop. Mountain gorillas in Virunga National Park exemplify these threats. In 2008, poachers killed 7 mountain gorillas, including the famous silverback named Senkwekwe. The perpetrators were believed to be part of a charcoal mafia, retaliating against park director Emmanuel de Merode for attempting to halt illegal charcoal production in the area. Charcoal is favored by locals due to its convenience, cleaner burning, and longer storage life compared to wood fuel. This preference poses a significant threat to Virunga's remaining forests, with 25% lost to charcoal production since the early 2000s. To combat this issue, Merode proposed a hydroelectric dam, schools, and a soap-making facility financed by European governments and Howard Buffett, son of investor Warren Buffett. However, Shellenberger raises questions about Merode's approach, suggesting that his methods may not effectively address the root cause of conflict poverty. Despite his efforts to provide electricity and create economic opportunities through the hydroelectric dam, locals continue to rely on charcoal for cooking due to its affordability and accessibility. Examining past conservation practices, Shellenberger reveals historical biases in favor of European colonizers. They established national parks like Virunga without considering the needs or rights of local communities. This often led to the displacement of indigenous peoples, causing social, political, and economic strife for those impacted by conservation initiatives. These practices have resulted in millions of conservation, refugees, worldwide individuals who have lost their ancestral lands due to nature preservation efforts. Such displacement can lead to increased stress, poor health, and a lack of alternative livelihoods for affected populations. while modern conservation organizations strive to involve local communities and respect indigenous peoples' rights. Shellenberger argues that many continue to struggle with balancing human needs and wildlife preservation. For instance, efforts to reduce charcoal use often fail due to the unavailability of viable alternatives or inadequate compensation for local communities sacrificing their traditional fuel sources. Ultimately, Shellenberger calls for a more comprehensive approach that acknowledges the interconnected nature of human well-being and environmental conservation. He suggests that empowering impoverished communities through access to modern energy sources like electricity and liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, may help reduce reliance on charcoal and preserve vital ecosystems for future generations. Chapter 5, Sweatshops Save the Planet. Michael Shellenberger's narrative explores the environmental impact of fashion and manufacturing, challenging common misconceptions about their roles in deforestation and climate change. In fall 2019, Extinction Rebellion activists protested during London Fashion Week, highlighting the industry's contribution to 10% of global carbon emissions. The protesters used dramatic tactics like fake blood, a funeral march, and bold signage to grab attention. They also targeted fast fashion retailers like H&M for perpetuating an unsustainable system of seasonal trends and relentless material creation. These protests echoed concerns raised by environmentalists about the fashion industry's rapid growth, predicted to increase by 81% by 2030. This expansion puts immense strain on Earth's dwindling resources. Shellenberger argues, however, that factories in developing countries have historically driven progress rather than destruction. They've freed up land for wildlife as agricultural productivity has increased, thanks to modern machinery and technology. The author, through personal experiences and research, tells the story of Supardi, an Indonesian woman who left her rural life to work in city factories. Initially drawn by promises of better wages, Supardi found urban life challenging. She worked long hours at a metal factory, enduring yelling and adjusting to city life. Later, she transitioned to a chocolate factory, progressively taking on more responsible roles. Shellenberger contrasts Supardi's journey with that of women in less industrialized settings like Congo. Bernadette, a fictional character, must laboriously produce all her food and energy due to lack of access to cheaper alternatives. This stark contrast underscores the liberating impact of urbanization and manufacturing on rural populations. Through Supardi's story, Shellenberger illustrates how factories offer unskilled workers like her a path out of poverty. These jobs, while not perfect, enable women to earn money, gain independence, and eventually lift their families from rural subsistence. This narrative contradicts the alarmism spread by groups like Extinction Rebellion and Greenpeace, which portray factories as primary drivers of deforestation. Shellenberger also discusses how increased productivity in farming has allowed nations to allocate less land to agriculture while producing more food. This efficiency has freed up land for wildlife and reforestation efforts. He critiques the notion that consumption-driven industries, including fashion, are environmentally unsustainable, arguing that technological advancements can enhance yields and reduce pollution. Lastly, Shellenberger emphasizes how wealth creation through manufacturing has historically improved human rights and environmental conditions. As nations develop economically, they tend to become less corrupt and more conducive to environmental protection. Thus, promoting industrial growth in poorer countries can lead to better global living standards and ecological health, rather than the opposite as commonly feared. Chapter 6, Greed Saved the Whales, Not Greenpeace. Michael Shellenberger's narrative delves into the complex relationship between humans, whales, and environmental activism, highlighting biases, alarmism, and financial interests. The story begins with the majestic blue whale, nature's grand creation, yet humans nearly hunted them to extinction in the mid-20th century using massive industrial ships. Shellenberger debunks the romanticized notion of ancient reverence for whales by indigenous cultures. In reality, these societies hunted whales for survival and profit. Whaling has a long history, from Basque towers in Spain to Japanese consortiums and American sailing vessels. The demand for whale products like oil, meat, and baleen drove this industry. The rise of petroleum in the late 1800s significantly impacted whaling. Samuel Keir discovered uses for petroleum, such as medicine and lighting fluid, which eventually replaced whale oil. In 1859, Edwin Drake's oil strike in Pennsylvania led to widespread production of kerosene from petroleum, outpacing whale oil in no time. By the early 1900s, rising demand for new products like soap and margarine pushed whale oil out of the market further. Surprisingly, the International Whaling Commission's IWC moratorium on commercial whaling in 1982 came too late to prevent mass whale slaughter. Between 1904 and 1978, 1 million whales were killed, 3 times more than during the entire 19th century. Shellenberger argues that economic growth, not environmental regulations, drove this shift. He introduces Cesare Marchetti's substitution model of technological change, illustrating how human societies tend to transition from less energy-dense to more energy-dense fuels. Marchetti's model accurately predicted this trend, but was off on timing, as seen in the delayed shift away from coal and slower-than-expected adoption of renewables. Next, Shellenberger discusses Gasland, a documentary that sparked fear about fracking for natural gas. The film claimed fracking contaminated water and caused health issues, but its central evidence was later proven false by Colorado's oil and gas regulator. Despite this debunking, Gasland fueled opposition to fracking based on misinformation. Shellenberger contrasts natural gas with coal, highlighting how the former is cleaner, safer, and more efficient. Fracking allowed U.S. carbon emissions from energy to decrease by 13% between 2005 and 2018, crucially slowing climate change. However, environmental activists like Bill McKibben incorrectly argue that natural gas is worse for the climate than coal due to short-term methane emissions concerns. The narrative then turns to genetically modified salmon, showcasing how this technology could reduce overfishing and its devastating impact on marine ecosystems. Despite its benefits, such as faster growth and less feed needed, many environmental groups oppose it. Their resistance stems from unfounded fears of contaminating wild fish populations, rather than the actual environmental advantages of this innovation. Lastly, Shellenberger explores class warfare in energy transitions, demonstrated by how elites often resist new technologies due to vested interests. Wealthy Victorians opposed coal because it was seen as inferior and polluting compared to wood burning. Similarly, modern environmental groups, backed by financial means, oppose fracking and genetically modified fish despite their clear environmental benefits. Shellenberger concludes that public attitudes and political action significantly impact environmental protection. Freed from financial interests and misinformation, society can embrace cleaner technologies and sustainable practices for a healthier planet. Chapter 7, Have Your Steak and Eat It Too. Michael Shellenberger, in his writing, delves into the environmental impacts associated with vegetarianism and meat consumption. He begins by recounting personal stories from childhood that sparked interest in questioning the ethics of eating animals. As an adult, he explores the environmental case for vegetarianism, citing the 2019 IPCC report, which suggests reducing meat consumption to combat climate change. However, Shellenberger highlights that many people, including himself, were surprised to learn that the 70% reduction in emissions referred only to agricultural emissions, not total greenhouse gas emissions. Various studies show that switching to vegetarianism or veganism would result in relatively small decreases in overall emissions, around 4–5%. He argues that the focus on personal dietary choices overlooks the bigger picture of energy use and climate change. For instance, reducing meat consumption slightly might not significantly lower emissions, but changing how we generate electricity, fossil fuels versus renewable sources, could have a much greater impact. Shellenberger also points out that meat production isn't as detrimental to the environment as commonly believed. He notes that converting land previously used for pasture back into forests could reduce emissions by just 10% if everyone became vegan, according to IPCC estimates. He emphasizes that the shift from beef to chicken has been more environmentally friendly due to higher efficiency in chicken farming. Chickens need less feed and space than cattle. This efficiency means less land use for the same amount of protein. Moreover, Shellenberger discusses the rebound effect. When people save money by eating less meat, they might spend it on other energy-intensive products or services, negating some of the carbon savings. The author also addresses the misconception that factory farming is worse for nature than organic, free-range farming. He explains that while factory farms are indeed efficient in terms of land and feed use, organic farming often requires more space per unit of meat or dairy produced, potentially threatening wildlife habitats. Shellenberger critiques the notion that everyone should adopt a vegan diet for environmental reasons without considering all the implications. He points out that such a radical shift could have unintended consequences and might not even be necessary to address climate change effectively. Ultimately, Shellenberger argues for a nuanced understanding of food systems and their environmental impacts. Instead of promoting extreme dietary changes based on limited evidence, he advocates for broader solutions like improving farming practices, reducing meat consumption moderately, and prioritizing renewable energy sources. Chapter 8, Saving Nature is Bomb. Michael Shellenberger's chapter explores the complex relationship between environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests in the context of nuclear energy. In The End of Nuclear Energy, Shellenberger discusses how public opinion and policy shifted against nuclear power following the Fukushima disaster in 2011. He argues that this decline was already underway due to aging infrastructure, lack of new construction, and increasing costs. The Fukushima accident accelerated this trend, prompting countries like Germany, Taiwan, and South Korea to phase out nuclear energy. Shellenberger highlights that making nuclear plants safer increases their expense, requiring significant government subsidies to remain competitive. He cites the financial burden of accidents such as Fukushima, estimated at $315 billion to $728 billion, contributing to the high cost of nuclear electricity. Moreover, construction delays and budget overruns at new reactors worldwide further underscore nuclear's financial challenges. The author contrasts this with renewable energy technologies like solar panels and wind turbines, which have seen costs drop by 75% and 25%, respectively, since 2011 due to increased production and improved efficiency, a phenomenon known as a positive learning curve. Nuclear power, however, has a negative learning curve, where construction times lengthen and costs rise despite experience gained. Shellenberger notes the global trend of developed nations abandoning nuclear energy. Germany is nearly phased out. France plans to reduce its reliance from 80% to 50%, and the US could see a similar decline in nuclear's contribution to electricity generation by 2030. That could be quite nasty. Shellenberger profiles Jerry Thomas, a radiation health expert. Her early life tragedy, losing her mother to leukemia, inspired her to pursue medicine and study the impact of air pollution on human health. Thomas's research led her to focus on thyroid cancer linked to the Chernobyl disaster, where she established the Chernobyl Tissue Bank for further scientific investigation. Shellenberger challenges common perceptions about Chernobyl's public health consequences, emphasizing that while 28 firefighters died immediately after the accident, the long-term cancer impact has been less severe than initially feared. Only around 5,000 cases of thyroid cancer have been definitively linked to Chernobyl radiation exposure, and most are curable with minimal mortality risk due to advanced hormone replacement therapy. In France Beats Germany, Shellenberger compares energy policies of France and Germany, arguing that Germany's decision to phase out nuclear power while ramping up renewables has resulted in increased reliance on fossil fuels. This shift, he claims, has cost German citizens $12 billion annually due to excess deaths from air pollution-related diseases. He posits that had Germany invested in nuclear power instead of renewables, it could have achieved 100% zero-emission electricity generation. The author emphasizes the historical environmental benefits of nuclear energy, including its low carbon footprint and contribution to improved air quality by displacing coal-fired power plants. Shellenberger contends that replacing nuclear with fossil fuels results in additional mortality risks. Naturally Nuclear recounts the 1960s support for nuclear energy among conservationists, including Sierra Club board member Will Seary. Despite initial resistance from some members, the Sierra Club ultimately decided not to oppose PG&E's plans for a nuclear plant at Diablo Canyon, due to Seary's advocacy for clean energy alternatives to combat air pollution and preserve natural landscapes. Atoms for Peace revisits President Eisenhower's 1953 proposal to leverage nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, including electricity generation. Motivated by the potential for universal prosperity through access to cheap energy, Eisenhower's vision aimed to counterbalance the destructive capabilities of atomic weapons. The speech was met with global enthusiasm until opposition to nuclear power began to rise in the mid-1960s. The war on nuclear traces the evolution of anti-nuclear sentiment, from grassroots activism led by individuals like David Pessonen to organized campaigns by environmental groups such as the Sierra Club and Union of Concerned Scientists. Shellenberger illustrates how fear-mongering tactics, often employed by charismatic figures like Ralph Nader and Jane Fonda, contributed to public skepticism about nuclear power. This activism led to legal challenges, delays, and increased construction costs for nuclear projects. Anti-nuclear groups actively lobbied for stricter regulations, portraying nuclear energy as an environmental menace and promoting alternative sources like coal. Despite the well-documented health risks of air pollution from fossil fuels, these campaigns successfully swayed public opinion against nuclear power. The Power in Danger examines the consequences of anti-nuclear activism: increased reliance on coal for electricity generation, higher emissions, and avoidable deaths from air pollution. Shellenberger asserts that environmental groups' primary concern was not safety, but rather the promotion of alternatives to curb industrial growth. He highlights instances where anti-nuclear advocacy directly resulted in the conversion of nuclear plants to coal-fired ones, despite acknowledging the superior environmental credentials of nuclear power. In The Peace Bomb, Shellenberger explores the paradoxical relationship between nuclear weapons and energy production. Despite shared public fears, nuclear bombs have not led to global apocalypse, while nuclear power has provided clean energy for decades without catastrophic incidents on par with those associated with conventional fuels. He emphasizes the historical precedent of leaders deterring war through mutual assured destruction, MAD, citing the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis as a pivotal moment in preventing nuclear conflict. Ultimately, Shellenberger argues that environmental biases and alarmism, fueled by financial interests and fear-based narratives, have shaped public perception of nuclear energy. This chapter underscores the need for a nuanced understanding of nuclear power's benefits and risks in the broader context of global energy production and climate change mitigation strategies. Chapter 9: Destroying the Environment to Save It. In spring 2015, Michael Shellenberger highlighted Elon Musk's vision for transforming energy production through solar panels and batteries during a presentation. Musk emphasized the need to address rising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere by harnessing solar power. He proposed that solar panels could be installed on rooftops, requiring minimal land use, and that energy generated during the day could be stored for nighttime use with Tesla's new product, Powerwall. Musk claimed that the United States could be powered entirely by solar energy using 160 million power packs, while the world could achieve this goal with 900 million units. Shellenberger, an advocate for a new Apollo project and renewable energy since 2002, saw this vision as revolutionary, similar to how smartphones transformed communication. However, Shellenberger pointed out several challenges preventing widespread adoption of solar panels and batteries. The initial investment is high. The cost of purchasing and installing a Tesla Powerwall exceeds $10,000, with additional costs for solar panel installation ranging from $10,000 to $30,000. This investment would take over 17 years to recoup based on average electricity usage and prices. Furthermore, solar power is intermittent and unreliable. Cloudy weather can quickly drain battery storage, as Shellenberger experienced during a stay at an eco-lodge in Uganda. Even with battery storage, energy generation fluctuates throughout the day, requiring smoothing solutions to ensure consistent power supply. Shellenberger also discussed the limitations of battery storage. While costs are declining, progress has been gradual, and current storage capabilities cannot meet the demands of backing up an entire grid for extended periods. For instance, 15,900 storage centers the size of Escondido, California's largest facility, would be needed to store enough power for all U.S. households for 4 hours. Moreover, integrating unreliable wind energy into the grid increases costs as backup power plants and infrastructure become necessary to compensate for fluctuations in wind speed. A study by climate and energy scientists estimated that implementing a battery-based system to ensure reliable solar and wind power would cost over $23 trillion, more than the U.S. GDP in 2019. Despite these challenges, Shellenberger noted that energy analysts predict renewables will become a larger source of electricity globally by 2050, with solar and wind accounting for nearly half of all power generation. However, this projection overlooks the relatively small contributions of solar, 3%, and wind, 64% from hydropower, in 2018. The author also examined the environmental impacts of renewable energy initiatives. In New Hampshire, local activist Lisa Linos led a grassroots movement against industrial wind turbines due to their harmful effects on wildlife, particularly bats and birds. Wind farms require vast amounts of land, disrupting habitats and causing significant mortality among threatened species like whooping cranes and golden eagles. In Germany, despite extensive investments in renewables through the Energiewende program, the country still relies heavily on natural gas for backup power. This reliance has driven up electricity prices and increased carbon emissions, undermining the initial goals of the energy transition. Shellenberger argued that similar challenges could hinder global efforts to scale up renewable energy, as demonstrated by slowed progress in Germany and other countries. Throughout history, proponents of renewable energy have often overlooked practical limitations and environmental consequences. In 1833, John Etzler proposed a utopian vision for harnessing solar, wind, and water power, but his ideas faced challenges in implementation due to low efficiency and land requirements. Similar visions emerged during the mid-20th century from influential figures like Martin Heidegger and Murray Bookchin, who envisioned a harmonious integration of nature and human society powered by renewable energy. Despite these historical precedents, modern advocates persist in promoting the widespread adoption of unreliable, low-density energy sources like solar panels and wind turbines. Shellenberger argues that their vision disregards crucial lessons from past failures and environmental trade-offs. In summary, Michael Shellenberger's narrative explores the complexities surrounding renewable energy adoption, highlighting environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests. He presents Musk's vision for solar power as promising yet overlooking significant challenges like high upfront costs and intermittent reliability. Shellenberger also exposes the environmental impacts of renewables on wildlife, particularly bats and birds, and critiques their inefficiency compared to established energy sources. Through historical examples and contemporary observations, he underscores the importance of considering both ecological consequences and practical limitations when pursuing sustainable energy solutions. Chapter 10, All About the Green. Michael Shellenberger presents a compelling narrative about environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests within the climate change discourse. He begins by discussing the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI, often seen as a major influencer in Washington's climate denial scene. The CEI, under Director Myron Ebell, has been instrumental in questioning established climate science, funded largely by fossil fuel companies. Ebell, who helped establish the Cooler Heads Coalition in 1998 to dispel global warming myths, was later appointed by President Trump to oversee the Environmental Protection Agency's transition. Despite the widespread acceptance of climate change, Ebell and CEI have continued their efforts to sow doubt about human-caused global warming. Shellenberger reveals that many of CEI's donors are fossil fuel companies with vested interests in weakening regulations. ExxonMobil, for instance, is highlighted as a key player in misleading the public by funding climate-skeptic organizations while being aware since the 1970s that burning fossil fuels contributes to global warming. Interestingly, Shellenberger points out that many environmental activists also receive funding from fossil fuel interests, creating an ironic situation where these activists criticize others for accepting such funds while doing the same themselves. For example, Tom Steyer, a billionaire investing in all three main fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, funds organizations like 350org, which oppose fossil fuel use. Yet, Steyer's philanthropic trust has donated significant sums to 350org. Shellenberger further explores the hypocrisy of prominent environmental groups accepting money from industries they claim to oppose. For instance, Bill McKibben, a leading climate activist and founder of 350org, has taken money from Steyer, who profits from fossil fuel investments. Similarly, organizations like Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, receive funding from natural gas companies while advocating for renewable energy. The narrative also uncovers how these groups have historically sought to close nuclear power plants, benefiting competitors in the fossil fuel and renewable energy sectors. Nuclear plants generate large amounts of electricity. Thus, their closure means substantial financial gains for natural gas and renewable companies. Shellenberger highlights how major environmental organizations like NRDC, Sierra Club, and EDF have long been involved in closing nuclear plants to replace them with fossil fuels and a mix of renewables. Shellenberger criticizes the strategy of accepting money from oil and gas investors to promote renewable energy as a way to undermine the role of nuclear power, which is crucial in reducing carbon emissions. He provides historical examples such as Jerry Brown's anti-nuclear efforts in California during his governorship in the 1970s, driven partly by family business interests in Indonesian oil and later in natural gas projects. Moreover, Shellenberger sheds light on Al Gore S. and Jr.'s ties to fossil fuel industries, illustrating how politicians have leveraged their positions to benefit from oil, coal, and gas interests while championing environmental causes. He also mentions the 2013 deal where Al Gore sold Current TV to Qatar's Al Jazeera, despite his earlier emphasis on reducing dependence on expensive dirty oil. Throughout his analysis, Shellenberger argues that climate activists often overlook the financial interests behind their own organizations. He highlights how seemingly altruistic environmental philanthropies can have monetary stakes in their advocacy. An example is Sea Change, a foundation founded by venture capitalist Nathaniel Simons, who had investments in companies receiving federal loans and grants for green initiatives. In essence, Shellenberger exposes the complex web of financial interests within both climate change denial organizations and environmental activism. He argues that understanding these motivations is crucial to assessing the true goals behind various positions on climate policy. Ultimately, he suggests that ignoring such biases risks perpetuating a system where powerful players profit from climate change policies while claiming to combat it. Chapter 11, The Denial of Power. Michael Shellenberger's exploration delves into the world of environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests, particularly within the context of climate change activism. In 2019, influential figures like Google, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Prince Harry convened in Italy to strategize on how their fame could aid the climate cause. This gathering, held at a luxurious resort in Sicily, was ironic given its extravagance: private jets, superyachts, and five-star amenities. Yet, many participants were quick to lecture others about low-energy living while emitting substantial fossil fuel footprints themselves. Prince Harry, for instance, took additional trips on private planes to Ibiza and Nice, causing 6 times more emissions than an average British citizen annually. His actions were defended by friends like Elton John and Ellen DeGeneres, but critics argued that it was hypocritical to preach about climate change while engaging in such high-energy lifestyles. Shellenberger also highlights Greta Thunberg's sailing trip from Europe to New York, which produced more emissions than flying due to the crew needed for the sailboat. This shows that even those genuinely concerned about climate change can unintentionally contribute significant carbon footprints. The author points out that wealthy nations' push for low-energy living in developing countries is misguided and often driven by financial interests. For example, the World Bank has redirected funding from reliable energy sources like hydroelectricity towards expensive and intermittent renewables, such as solar and wind power. This shift is largely due to influence from Western environmental NGOs and UN agencies. Shellenberger examines the concept of leapfrogging, the idea that poor nations can bypass fossil fuels straight into renewable energy, as promoted by the United Nations since 1987. However, he argues there's no historical precedent for this model, noting that every developed nation relied heavily on fossil fuels during its industrialization. He criticizes the International Rivers NGO for opposing hydroelectric dams in developing countries under the guise of environmental protection. Despite these dams providing affordable, reliable power crucial for development, groups like International Rivers prioritize recreational activities over practical needs. Furthermore, Shellenberger explores the phenomenon of climate celebrities advocating for reduced carbon footprints while themselves indulging in high-energy lifestyles. He suggests this isn't ignorance but a display of privilege, a bold statement that the rules don't apply to them. Lastly, Shellenberger discusses the biases within environmental policies and research. He argues that there's a significant imbalance in publications favoring renewables over nuclear energy, influencing International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, reports. This bias can negatively impact the energy choices available to developing nations, potentially hindering their progress towards sustainable development. In essence, Shellenberger uncovers the complex interplay between environmental advocacy, financial interests, and power dynamics in global climate policy, revealing potential pitfalls and contradictions within these systems. Chapter 12, False Gods for Lost Souls. Michael Shellenberger explores the concept of environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests in his book, Apocalypse Never. He argues that many environmentalists have been misled by exaggerated claims about climate change, often driven by political agendas rather than scientific evidence. Shellenberger begins by discussing the polar bear video posted by National Geographic in 2017, which became a viral sensation and symbolized the supposed effects of climate change. However, he points out that this video oversimplified the situation, as polar bear populations have not declined as drastically as feared. This example illustrates how environmental alarmism can mislead the public. Next, Shellenberger delves into the history of climate denialism and the influence of fossil fuel companies on shaping public opinion. He references Harvard historians Naomi Orsk's and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, which alleges that these industries have deliberately misled the public about climate science, similar to how tobacco companies once did with smoking and cancer. The author then discusses the 1983 National Academy of Sciences report on climate change, arguing that conservative voices within the organization overshadowed the concerns of natural scientists like John Perry. This incident, according to Shellenberger, marked a critical moment in climate denialism's tactics. Shellenberger also examines the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and its summaries for policymakers. He contends that these summaries often overemphasize worst-case scenarios to serve political goals, leading to exaggerated claims about climate change impacts. This is exemplified by the IPCC's apocalyptic summaries and press releases, which Shellenberger argues are influenced by both internal biases and external pressure from environmental activists and media outlets. The book then turns to the case of Roger Pielke, a climate scientist targeted by politicians like Raul Grijalva for alleged ties to fossil fuel industries. Despite no evidence supporting these claims, Pielke was subjected to intense scrutiny and investigation. Shellenberger uses this example to highlight the politicization of climate science and the potential for character assassination in environmental debates. In another section, Shellenberger critiques Bill McKibben's assertion that climate change is humanity's greatest challenge. To support his argument, Shellenberger points out historical events like the Black Death, world wars, and infectious disease control, which caused more deaths and destruction than current climate trends suggest. The author also explores the religious undertones of environmentalism, suggesting that many environmentalists project their own values onto nature. He argues that this can lead to apocalyptic views on climate change, which may not be grounded in scientific reality, but rather driven by unconscious psychological and spiritual needs. Shellenberger discusses the phenomenon of apocalypse angst, where some individuals find a strange mix of fear and desire in apocalyptic scenarios. He suggests that this might explain why environmental activists often oppose technologies that could mitigate climate change, even though these technologies are essential for human development. The book also touches on the consequences of environmental alarmism, such as increased anxiety and depression among young people. Shellenberger interviews teenagers who feel overwhelmed by messages about impending doom and discuss how these fears can lead to feelings of helplessness and despair. Lastly, Shellenberger proposes environmental humanism as a solution to counteract the negative aspects of contemporary environmentalism. He advocates for an approach that balances scientific rationality with human values, emphasizing love for humanity and nature while promoting technological progress and economic development in both developed and developing nations. Throughout Apocalypse Never, Shellenberger critically examines environmental biases, alarmism, and financial interests, arguing that a more balanced perspective is needed to address climate change effectively while promoting human flourishing and environmental progress. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.